Hola a todo el mundo. Ahora vamos a vender pandas, ya que ese video sí tiene subtítulos. Mm, sí, que me llegue el strike. Yo le quito la música. Hola a todo el mundo. Si les gusta lo que ven, déjenme un like, compartan, suscríbanse, revisen todo lo que promuevo debajo en la descripción. Debajo en la descripción también están las notas, este archivo, este archivo. Debajo de las notas también está este archivo de pandas. Eh, bueno, comencemos. Ya tengo algo de hecho esto. Y aquí en el archivo de pandas está el... Este es como el resumen.
Hey there, how's it going, everybody? In this series of videos, we're going to be learning how to use the
Bueno, ahí están los subtítulos.
Pandas library in Python. So Pandas is a data analysis library that allows us to easily read in and work with different types of data. So we can use this to analyze CSV files,
Tipos de
Excel files,
datos,
and other similar formats. So if you're getting into the data science field, then this library is going to be essential to learn. It's one of the most downloaded packages for Python, and that's for a great reason. So not only does it allow us to easily read in and analyze data, but it also has great performance since it's built on top of NumPy. And we'll be learning how to do different types of an analysis or of data analysis in this series. So in this video, we're going to be going over how to get Pandas installed, how to download the data that I'll be using for most of this series, and also how to get all of this open in a Jupyter notebook so that we're ready to do some coding and analysis. Now, I'd also like to mention that we do have a sponsor for this series of videos, and that is Brilliant.org. So I really want to thank Brilliant for sponsoring this series, and it would be great if you all could check them out using the link in the description section below and support the sponsors. And I'll talk more about their
Abajo también
services in
está
just a
cómo
bit.
ponerle
So with that
subtítulos a
said,
los
let's go ahead and get started.
video, cómo
So
ponerle
first of all,
subtítulos
let's install Pandas. So
a los
I'm using a
videos.
clean virtual environment for this series, but you don't have to use a virtual environment if you don't want to. If you don't know what a virtual environment is
No vamos a
and would like to learn
utilizar
more about
un entorno virtual, vamos a utilizar Google Colab. ¿Cómo se llega a Google Colab? Uno pone Google Colab, welcome to Google Colab, y, y se le pone nuevo cuaderno, y ustedes le ponen cualquier cosa. Ya tengo uno, yo les pongo el link.
those, then I'll be sure to leave a link to my video on that topic in the description section below if anyone is interested. So it's really easy to install Pandas here. All we need to do is say pip install Pandas, and we will let this run through. And once we have Pandas installed, then let's also install Jupyter so that we can use Jupyter notebooks. Now, I was a bit hesitant to use Jupyter for this series because some people find it difficult to get the hang of, But honestly, if you're going to be doing a lot of work with pandas, then it's definitely a nice tool to use for
Abramos
this.
el
So now it's not necessary, so you should be
proyecto.
able to follow along with this series just fine if you're using a regular editor. But Jupyter Notebooks allows us to actually see our data more easily by using the browser to print out our data in tables that make it easier to
No lo tengo.
visualize. So I'm going to use it in the series, but you don't have to in order
Instalemos
to
aquí
follow
mismo
along.
pandas.
So to install Jupyter, I'm going to say pip install, and this is going to be Jupyter Lab, and this is spelled Jupyterlab, Jupyter Lab. So we'll get that installed. Now, I'm not going to go into a deep dive in how to use Jupyter in this series. I'm mainly going to
Entonces,
focus on pandas, but if you'd like a
Jupyter.
detailed overview of how to use
Ah,
Jupyter, then I do have a video on how to use Jupyter in depth, and I'll leave a link to that video in the description section below if anyone would like to learn more about the details of using that. Okay, so now we have
solo para
Pandas
que
and
vean cómo
Jupyter
se
Notebooks
ejecuta.
installed. Now we're going to need to download the data that I'll be using for most of this series. Now, for anyone who's been watching my latest videos, you know that I like to use the Stack Overflow Developer Survey for different kinds of data
Entonces,
analysis.
el Stack
Now, the reason
Overflow
that I like to
Developer
use this
Survey.
data is because it's real world data. And it has a lot of data in there that I think would be interesting to most people who are watching these types of videos. I've seen some other tutorials where the data just seems kind of unrealistic and not very relatable. So hopefully using this data will keep people interested and also give you a good idea of what it's like to actually download real data from a source and start analyzing it with pandas. So to download this
Stack
data,
View.
I have this pulled up here in the browser. We can
Ese
go
del
over to the
2020.
Stack Overflow.
Es del 2020. Es que instalando. Lo que vamos a hacer ahora es que este mismo archivo descargue el del 2020. Copiar dirección del enlace. En un, en un documento de collab descarga este link. Instalamos Python. Entonces código. Extraer. Stack Overflow Survey. Digamos que extraiga un sample data. Entonces instalemos pandas y ahora corramos esto. Descarga completa y archivo descomprimida. Survey Resource. Bueno, genial. Ya
Survey results
pensé
page.
que eso iba a
Now, this
demorar
is easy
más.
to find if you just Google it, but just to keep things easy, I'll have a link to this download page in the description section as well. Okay, now on this page, you can download the data in CSV form for any year that they have available. Now, I'm going to go ahead and download the 2019 data, which is the top data here. So I'm
Ah, del 2019, no el del 2020. 2019. En la carpeta sample. data, 2019. Voy a borrar este. Voy a borrar este. Voy a borrar este. 2019. 2019. Ok, entonces vamos a volverlo a ejecutar. Entonces ya lo descargó.
I'm going to download this CSV here, and then we'll click on download again, and this should go ahead and download this for us. Okay, it did. And now I'm going to open this in my Finder here, and I'm going to unzip this data. It comes in a zip drive. And once that data is downloaded and unzipped, I'm going to go ahead and drag that folder to a folder here on my desktop. And that's where we'll also create a notebook and analyze this data. So, real quick, I
Revisar
don't have
estos
this open.
datos.
Let me open up
¿Se alcanzan a ver?
this Pandas demo folder, and this will open this in Finder. And now I will take the data and drag this into this Pandas demo folder that is on my desktop. So your projects can be anywhere, but I just created a project folder here on my desktop called Pandas Demo, and it's completely empty except for the data that we just dragged in here. So now I'm going to rename this, since this is kind of a long name here. I'm just going to rename this to Data. That was named Developer Survey 2019, but I'm just going to call that Data
Vamos
so
a
that it's
darlos a
easy
por
for us
data.
to
De todo junto.
find that within our script. Okay, so what files do we have here in the directory that we unzipped in this data directory? Let me make this a little larger here. Okay, so first of all, if you download data that comes with a README, then this is usually helpful. We have a README file right here.
También podemos hacer
It
esto.
tells you what these other files are going to be. So in this case, we have this survey results public.csv, and that contains the main survey results, one respondent per row and one column per answer. And
Vamos a
the
ver si
survey
tenemos sobre
results
esos
schema
sobre.
here has the
Sí,
questions that correspond to
sí.
each column name in the results. Now, if any of this doesn't make sense now, then it will once we open up this data in Jupyter. So I'm just giving a broad overview here. Don't let this overwhelm you by everything that I'm saying here. This will make a lot more sense once we open this up in Jupyter. So let's go ahead and do that. So to open this in a Jupyter notebook, I'm going to go back to my terminal. So I'm going to go ahead and close these Finder windows open here. Go back to my terminal. And now within here, I'm going to navigate to my folder where I place that data. And this should be the same command on Mac, Linux, and Windows. So I'm going to say CD, and I'm going to go to my desktop. This is going to be wherever your project directory is, but mine is in this Pandas demo on my desktop. And once I am navigated to that directory,
Desde acá,
to start up a
solo para
Jupyter
que
notebook, we just
veamos.
need to say Jupyter notebook and run that. And we should see a server start up here. And it seems like it's taking a second. Okay, there we go. Now, back in our terminal here, this will run a Jupyter server. and you will need to leave that terminal open while you're working in Jupyter. So Jupyter runs, and you will need in our terminal here. There we go. See a server start up here, and it seems like it's taking a second.
Déjà vu eterno. Vamos a ver si así sí funciona. Preguntémosle al chat GPT. Debe ser Jupyter Lab. Entonces, Jupyter Lab. Hablámoslo con y funciona. Y miramos esto. Miremos algo de Letcode. Este. Launcher. Notebook. En kernel. Seleccionar.
Okay, there we go. Now, back in our
Entonces el
terminal
comando
here,
ahorita es Jupyter Lab.
this will run a Jupyter server, and you will need to leave that terminal open while you're working in Jupyter. So Jupyter
Por si
runs
no
in
lo
the
quieren
browser,
hacer en
so if you
collab.
shut down this server, then you won't be able to access our notebook. Okay, so let's go back here to the browser, and this is where we have our Jupyter notebooks. So let me zoom in here so that we can, so that everybody can read this fairly well. Okay, I'll zoom into about right there, I think is good. Okay, so we can see our data folder here that we downloaded and placed in our Jupyter demo folder a little bit ago. But now let's create a new notebook. So to create a new notebook, I'm going to click on New up here at the top right, and then I'm going to use Python 3. And now we can name our notebook. So up here where it says Untitled, I'm going to click here, and I'm just going to call this Pandas Demo, and rename that. Okay, so now we're ready to start using Pandas. So we can import this by saying import Pandas as PD. Now,
Vamos a cambiarle el nombre, a ver. Tengo que cambiarle el nombre de acá. Bueno, entonces ya eso no lo necesitamos. Y voy a cerrar el pandas y me voy a ir a collab.
importing Pandas as PD is just a common convention when using Pandas. So let's run that.
Entonces
And I
corremos
ran
eso.
that cell by pressing Shift and Enter. And again, I'm not going to go into the specifics of working here within Jupyter in this series, but if you'd like a rundown of the features and shortcuts that I'll be using, then I do have a link to my Jupyter video in the description
Estoy
section below.
aprendiendo,
Okay,
hola,
so for the
estoy
rest of this video,
aprendiendo
we'll see how to load in our data
pandas.
and look at some information about that data. So our data is in a CSV format. So in order to read in that CSV, we can simply say df,
No me ve
which
mucha
is going to
gente.
stand for data frame. We'll learn all about data frames here in a bit. We're going to say df is equal to pd dot read
Si eres
underscore
el único.
CSV. We're going to use the read
¿Sí estoy
CSV
bien?
method from Pandas here. And now we just want to pass in a path to our CSV file. Now mine was within that data folder, and that was within the file survey underscore results underscore public dot CSV. So now if I hit
Estamos aprendiendo
Shift Enter,
pandas.
then that will run that cell. So right off the bat, we can see that this is pretty simple to work with. So when using native Python, in order to
Ok.
read it,
Entonces corremos este. Ya lo corrimos.
in a CSV file, we need to use the CSV module to create a CSV reader and things like that.
Ya
But
lo
here, we're
leímos.
just doing this all in one line. So when it reads this in, it's going to read it in as a data frame. So data frames are pretty much the backbone of Pandas, and we'll go more into we'll go over data frames and series objects in depth in the next video. But for the basics, a data frame is basically just rows and columns of data. We can see what a data frame looks like, but just by printing it out. And this is the great thing about using Jupyter Notebooks, because it allows us to visualize these things in ways that we can't do in other editors. So here in Jupyter, I can simply just say df and run that, and it will print out our data frame here. So we didn't even need to wrap this here in a print function. Now, if you're using a normal editor, then you can still print out data frame information, but it's not going to look as good as it does here in Jupyter, where we get this interactive table. So this is a small look at our data. Now, this is actually 85 columns here, but if I scroll through these, then it doesn't look like there's actually 85 columns printed out here. So this is actually concatenated by default just to give us a broad overview of the data. So by default, Jupyter is displaying 20 columns from our data frame. Now, how did I know that there was 85 columns for this data frame? Well, there are a few attributes and methods that we can use to get an idea of what our data looks like. So first, we have the shape attribute, and shape gives us the number of rows and columns in a tuple form. So let's look at this. So in our next cell down here, I'm going to say df.shape, and I will run that. Now, this is an attribute here. It's not a method, so you don't want to put parentheses. So df.shape, and we can see that we have 88 88,000 rows and 85 columns. Now, if you wanted a bit more information, then we can use the info method. The info method will give us the number of rows and columns and also all of the data types of all the columns as well. Now, before I run that, it looks like my text is getting cut off here a little bit. Sometimes this happens whenever I'm within Jupyter. In order to fix
Yo no
this, I
tengo ese
usually just
problema.
come up here and restart and run all my cells again. That usually takes care of the problem. Let's see if that works. Okay, so that seemed to work. Another thing that you can do here is just to totally reload the page in the browser. And when you reload the page, I think it's just because of how I have this text enlarged, so it's kind of messing with how these look, but now we can see these just fine. Okay, so like I was saying, we can see here that we have 88,883 rows and 85 columns. Now, if
885
you
columnas.
wanted more information, then we can use the info method. And that will give us the number of rows and the number of columns, but also all of the data types of the columns. So let's run that. So if I do df.info, df.info.
Entonces, código
Now, this actually is a method, so we do want to put the
df.info.
parentheses there.
Es
And
un
let
método.
me run this. And now let's go over this output. So we can see here
Entonces,
that it says that we have
if enter.
88,883 entries. So those are our rows. We have a total of 85 columns. And then it lists all of our columns here for our data. So these are all the columns in our CSV file that we have loaded in. Now, it also gives us the data types of each of these columns. And we're going to go over data types in a future video. But for the most part, objects usually mean strings. And then we have other things as well. So int64 is just an integer. Float is a float, so probably a decimal number. And there are no other data types in this data set. But there are more
Entonces,
data types
objetos son
in general,
strings,
so I will be sure to do a
floats son
video on data
flotantes.
types specifically in the near
Entonces, él
future.
después nos va a explicar
Okay,
qué
so
son
now that
los
we know
tipos
the
de
number of
datos.
rows and columns, let's change a setting here within Jupyter so that we can see all of the columns. So I think it would be
A
useful to
ver,
see
todas
all of
las
these if
columnas.
we'd like to, even if there are a lot of these to scroll through. So to do this, we can change a setting, and I'm going to come down here to the bottom here, and I'm going to change a setting by saying pd.set_option, and within here I will say
Esto.
display.max_columns, and I will set that equal to 85 so that we can see all of our
85.
columns, and I will run that. And now, if we print out our
Borramos
data frame,
esta.
so I'm going to go back up here to where we printed
Entonces,
out
otra vez de
this
F.
data frame, and I will rerun that cell. And now if I scroll through these columns, then
Ahora
we
sí
can
están
see that now it
85.
looks like we actually have these 85 different columns here. So I can keep scrolling, and it didn't just chop us off at that 20 like it was before. Now, obviously, the rows are also being concatenated here, and we
Arrow si
definitely
no
don't
se
want to print
muestra.
out all 89,000 of these rows, but there probably are some examples with certain data sets where you might want to see all of the rows as well. So, for example, I said that the survey results schema.csv file that was included in our download gives the matching questions for all of these column names here. So if we wanted to see what these column names here mean for this data, then we can load in that schema CSV file as well. So let me do this. I'll go down to the bottom of our notebook, and I will just load this in by saying schema_df. Now, I don't want to just call this df because we don't want to overwrite our other data frame. And I will load this in just like we
El
saw
esquema.
before by saying pd.read_csv.
Y me
And
tocaba por
this
ese
is
estar bien,
within the
ese
data
estar bien,
folder.
quedé
And
pensando
this
en
was
eso.
called
Solamente estoy aprendiendo en
survey_schema.csv.
público.
So I will run this. And now let's look at
Hola.
this schema data frame that we just loaded in. So here we on this column
Lo
column
corremos
here,
y lo
this
mostramos.
gives us all of the columns in our other data frame. So we have respondent, main branch, hobbyist, and if I scroll up to that data frame here, I'm going to delete this info here since we no longer need that. If I scroll up to this data frame here, then we can see respondent, main branch, hobbyist. So if we want to know what these mean, then that's what we use the schema for. So we can see that main branch or hobbyist means do you code as a hobby? Main branch means which of the following options best describes. Now it actually concatenates the text too. In order to actually see this the full text, we could either change an option or we could just access this value directly. And I will be showing you how to do that in the next video. But for now, we can see that we can't see all of the rows to the questions that correlate to each column name here. Remember, we have 85 columns, but for here we can only see the first 5, and then we get this ellipses here, and then we can see the last 5. So let's set this up so that we can view 85 rows and then reprint this so that we can see all of these. So back in the same cell where we set our max columns, now let's also add one for rows as well. So I'm just going to copy and paste that, but instead of max columns here, I'm going to have this be max rows, and I will run that. And now we will rerun this schema here, and now we can see that we can see all of the columns and the corresponding question text. So if you wanted to know what any of these columns mean, then this is how we do it. So we can see IT person. The question was, are you the IT support person for your family? So that's probably a yes or no question. So that is what those mean. So if you're going through this data on your own, then you can use this as a reference anytime you don't know what a certain column means in our survey data. And if you don't know, or if you don't want to look through all of these to find a specific row for a specific column name, then in a future video, we're going to learn about filtering data frames and see how we can just grab a specific row where the column equals a certain value. Okay, so now we have all 85 rows visible of our schema data frame here, but you might be thinking, well, that's nice, but I don't want to see 85 rows of my survey data every time I want to look at it. But there are a couple of methods that we can use to only see a certain number of rows, which you'll most likely use a lot just to get an idea that your filters and data frames seem to be working correctly. So we can see the first 5 rows by saying, instead of doing a df here, we can say df.head. And if I run that, then we just get the first 5 rows here. Okay? And you can pass in a value if you want to see a certain number of values. So if you wanted to see the first 10 rows, then we could pass in a 10 to df.head. And this gives us the first 10 rows. So we can see it goes all the way down 0 through 9 there. Now, if you'd like to see the last rows instead of the first rows, then we can use the tail method instead. So if we say df.tail, and we could use it without a number also, but if we pass in a number just like with head, then now we're going to say that we want the last 10 entries here in our data. So those are the last 10 items of our data. Okay, so this is a brief overview of getting Pandas installed and then downloading our data and loading our data into Jupyter and how to read this in. Now, before we end here, I'd like to mention the sponsor of this video, and that is Brilliant.org. So in this series, we've been learning about pandas and how to analyze data in Python. And Brilliant would be an excellent way to supplement what you learn here with their hands-on courses. They have some excellent courses in less indexes yet. That will be... Hey there, how's it going, everybody? In this video, we're going to continue learning more about pandas, and specifically, we're going to be learning about the data frame and series data types. So like I said in the last video, these are basically the backbone of pandas and are the 2 primary data types that you'll likely be using the most. So in this video, we're going to go over how we can think of data frames and series data types in a different way, and then we'll look at the basics of getting information from these data types. Now, hey there, how's it going, everybody? In this video, we're going to continue learning more about pandas, and specifically, we're going to be learning about the data frame and series data types. So like I said in the last video, These are basically the backbone of pandas and are the two primary data types that you'll likely be using the most. So in this video, we're going to go over how we can think of data frames and series data types in a different way, and then we'll look at the basics of getting information from these data types. Now, I would like to mention that we do have a sponsor for this series of videos, and that is Brilliant.org. So I really want to thank Brilliant for sponsoring the series, and it would be great if you all could check them out using the link in the description section below and support the sponsors. And I'll talk more about their services in just a bit. So with that said, let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so first, let's look at what a data frame is, and then we'll learn more about how we can think about this in terms of a Python object. So we saw data frames briefly in our last video when we checked to make sure that our data was loaded in correctly. So these were the objects that were displayed in Jupyter as rows and columns, basically a table. So let's take a look at what this looks like. So if you were following along with the last video, this is basically the same Jupyter notebook that I had before, except this is just cleaned up a bit. So we're importing pandas here. We are reading in our CSV files. So one is just our main data frame for our survey results. One is our schema data frame for the schema results. And then we are setting some options here where we have the max columns set to 85 so we can see all the columns, and the max rows set to 85 so that we can see all of the schema. Now, if you haven't been following along with the video so far, then I do have a link in the description section below that links to where you can download this data and follow along with this. Okay, so this is a data frame here. So where we are printing out df.head, this is what this returns. So this here is the first 5 rows of our data frame. So you can see that a data frame is made up of multiple rows here, and we also have multiple columns. So in the case of this data, these are survey results, but your data can be, whatever your data is, but it's most likely going to be in rows and columns, kind of like a table. So for this data, with these being survey results, each row is one person who answered the survey, and each question was their answer for that question on the survey. So for example, this respondent number 1 here, they answered that yes, they were a hobbyist. And if you want to know what hobbyist means, then just like we saw in the last video, we can look at our schema data frame. So let me go ahead and print this out here, and let's look at this. So if I look at what a hobbyist is, then we can see that that question was, do you code as a hobby? So that's what this data is, and that kind of gives us an idea of what a data frame is. Basically, a data frame is just rows and columns. But now let me explain how I like to think of data frames using native Python. So if we were only using Python and not using pandas to store information in rows and columns, then how would we do this? Well, for those of you familiar with dictionaries, you might think that it's a good idea to store information that way. So let me pull up a new notebook here that I have open here with some snippets, and let's take a look at this. Okay, so let's look at this first cell here. So a lot of us are probably familiar with Python dictionaries where we have keys and values. So if I'm representing some data, in this example, it's a person, then we can use a dictionary. So first,
Bueno, vamos a buscar el diccionario. Este es el código. Entonces, vamos a copiar vamos a copiar esto. En nuestro documento. nuestro documento. Código. Bueno,
First off, I have a key of first, which is going to be the first name. And then that has a value of Corey. And then we also have keys and values for the last name and the email as well. Okay, so this dictionary here represents data for a single person. But how would we represent data for multiple people? Well, there are probably a couple of different ways that we could do this, but the way that I like to think of this in terms of learning pandas is to make all of our values in our dictionaries a list. So let's take a look in the second cell here to see what this would look like. So here in the second cell, now we can see that we have a pretty similar dictionary to what we had above. But now, instead of just a single string here for the values, I instead have a list. And our list currently just has one person. But now, since this is a list, we can add more first names and information in here. So the first value of our list is going to be our first person. So if I go to the third cell down here at the bottom, then now we can use this as an example to see what this would look like with multiple people. So the second value in our list will be our second person, and the third value in the list will be our third person. So if we look here, we have people, we have a key of first. So if we want the second person here, we go to the second value, that's Jane. The last name is Doe, and the email, go to the second value here, is janedoe@email.com. If you want the third person, that would be John, and then third value and last would be Doe. Then third value in email is johndoe@email.com. So we can kind of think of this like rows and columns. The keys are the columns and the values are the rows. Now, if you look up the definition of a pandas data frame online, then you'll see a lot of definitions that just say something like it's a two-dimensional data structure. Now, that might sound a little confusing, but in layman's terms, that basically just means rows and columns. Okay, so like I said here, the key for email here would be our email column and contain all of the email values. And if we wanted to see the email column, then we can just access that key. So if I come down here actually, let me run all of these really quick here. I think I opened this up without running these, so I want to make sure that we have this registered. Okay, so if I wanted to see that email column, then I could simply say people and then access that email key. If I run that, then we can see that we got all of the emails. Now, the reason that I wanted to show you this is because I feel like this really helped me in terms of how I think about data frames. So data frames are very similar to this, but with more functionality than what we have here in standard Python. Now, we can actually create a data frame from this dictionary and see what this looks like. So let's do that and look at some basic data frame functionality. And then we'll look at this more using the Stack Overflow data from the last video. So here in this bottom cell, in order to create a data frame from the information that we have here, I'm going to go ahead and import pandas. So I'm going to say import pandas as PD. And now we can create a data frame actually using this dictionary that we have up here. So to do that, I can just say df is equal to pd.dataframe and check the casing there. That's a capital D and a capital F. And then we'll just pass in that dictionary that has values as list. So if I run this, and that seemed to run okay without any errors, and now let me just print out df here. And if I print that out, then we can see that now our data frame is representing this in a way to where we do have rows and columns that we can visualize. So we get these people printed out in a nice table of rows and columns. Now we also have these over here to the far left that don't have column names, this 0, 1, and 2. Now this is an index. Now I'm not going to go much into indexes right now because that's what the next video is going to cover, but basically it's a unique value for our rows. Now it doesn't need to be unique, but again, we'll talk more about that in the video specifically on indexes. So now that we have a bit of an idea of how to think about data frames, now let's take a look at how to access information here within the data frame. So first, let's just access the values of a single column. So just like we did with the dictionary, we can access a single column just like we were
¿Sí, dónde está la
accessing
columna?
the key of a dictionary. So just like I
df,
did people and email up here,
df
I can do
python
very similar down here and just say that I want that email
email.
column of my data frame. Now, that's not actually a key. That is going to access the column of a data frame.
La columna.
But we can see here that we get all of the emails back from that data frame. So again, I do want to emphasize that I only use the pure Python example so that we could get an idea of how to think about a data frame. But like I said, a data frame is much, much more than just a dictionary of lists. So for example, we can see that when we displayed the email column here, it doesn't look the same as when we displayed the list of values from that dictionary. And that's because this
No
is
se ve
actually
igual
returning a series.
porque
And
retorna una
we can
serie.
see this if we check the type. So if I check the type of this email column here, so let me run that. We can see that this is pandas.core.series.series. So this is a series
Una
object.
serie.
So what is a series? So a series is still basically a list of data, but just like with a data frame, it has a lot more functionality than just that. Now, if you look up the definition of a series online, then you'll see a lot of definitions that just say it's a one-dimensional array. And that might sound a little confusing, but in layman's terms, that basically just means that it's rows of data. So again, you can think of a data frame as being rows and columns, and a series
Filas y
as being
columnas. Una serie,
rows
una
of a
fila.
single column.
Una serie,
So
una
a data
fila.
frame is basically a container for multiple of these series objects. So again, that's important. So let me go over that one more time. So
Entonces,
we can see that a data frame here is two-dimensional because it has rows and columns. So we can see here that it has, first name, last name, email. Now, whenever we access just the email, then we can see that we get all these emails here. Now, this is a series.
si vieron, no me desconcentré en todos los 45 minutos porque estaba haciendo streaming. En cambio, si no estuviera haciendo streaming, me hubiera desconcentrado. Bueno, ¿será que alcanzo a terminar? No, no alcanzo a terminar. Entonces dejemos hasta ahí. Les dejé todo en la descripción. Si les gustó, déjenme un like, compartan, suscríbanse si les gusta. Si no, déjenme comentarios de que no les gusta. Revisen todo lo que promuevo en la descripción. Ahí también están los links de el archivo que estoy del collab que estoy haciendo y de los archivos originales por si quieren revisar el archivo, el video original. Tengan un día genial. Hasta luego.